Okay, thank you very much. So I'm in charge of a second session about optical clocks. So I work on strontium optical lattice clocks in a Paris observatory in a laboratory called CIRT, who also develops atom interferometry, microwave clocks, and space systems. So this is just a slide to make the connection between the previous session and the new one. So this is just to set the notation that I will use during this presentation. So you have two components for an optical clocks. First, a clock laser. So I will not discuss about that because I think it's the topic of the next session about optical clocks. And an atomic resonance. So I write F and E, the two states of the atomic resonance, and omega naught, the frequency of the proper frequency of this transition, and omega of t, the frequency of the clock laser. Now, the goal of this atomic species is to be able to probe it with the clock laser, measure the outcome of this measurement would be the transition probability, so the probability for the atom to go from the fundamental state, the ground state, to the excited state. From this probability, we build an error signal, and the error signal is used to lock this local oscillator, so the clock laser, on the atoms. So in the end, the frequency of the clock laser becomes equal to the proper frequency of the atomic resonance plus some perturbing effects, and these perturbing effects are the topic of this talk. So there are two kinds of perturbations. So systematic perturbation that, at least on short time scales, do not depend on time. So it's perturbation from the environment, and the uncertainty on these systematic effects is what is called the accuracy of the clock, plus some time-dependent perturbation that hopefully averages to zero, which is the frequency noise of the clock laser once it's locked on the atomic resonance, and it's characterized, so it's called the stability of the clock, and it's characterized by the Allen deviation of y of t, so y of t is just omega divided by omega naught. So this talk focuses on the limitations that we have now on these two parts, accuracy and stability. So on accuracy, there are systematic effects that come from motional effects, from the interaction between the atoms and the electromagnetic waves coming from the environment of the atoms, but also from interaction between the atoms. On the stability side, the main limitations are the impact of the frequency noise of the clock laser on the probing of the atoms, and a more fundamental limit is the quantum projection noise due to the quantum nature of the atoms. So this brings me to the content of, sorry, just a disclaimer. I will talk almost exclusively in this presentation about optical lattice clocks, so optical clocks with neutral atoms, for two reasons. First, because that's what I know, and the second reason is that the organizer asked me to do so. And so, but it would be unfair not to mention the ion clocks. So it's optical clocks with single ions, and that achieve really excellent results and continue to achieve that, especially with the ytterbium ion clock at PTB and the aluminum ion clock at NIST. So this is the content of my talk. So the first two parts are about stability and accuracy, and the organizers asked me not to talk about application, but I will do it anyway. So I will not discuss about application in fundamental physics because probably you have seen that already, but I will talk about applications in metrology. So what we do with our clocks to measure time and to compare them together. So I will start with stability. So we have seen, I've mentioned different sources of instability. I will start with the hardest one. So the first one that I mentioned is a Dicke effect, so it's due to the noise of the clock laser itself. So I start with something that is good. So there is noise on the clock laser. This noise makes that the frequency of the laser is moving, so the probability that is measured at the outcome of the interrogation between the clock laser and the atoms will have some noise. But this is good because this is precisely what the clock is for, to measure the noise of the clock laser and to correct for it. Okay. Unfortunately, there is a bad side to this probing, which comes from the dead time in the clock cycle. So I have depicted the clock cycle here. I think Michał has detailed that in the first lecture. So the interrogation of the atoms itself has only a limited time. In the cycles, there is what we call a dead time that is used to trap atoms, to prepare them, and to detect them. and during this dead time, the atoms do not see the frequency fluctuation of the clock laser. And I've depicted this clock cycle for two different interrogations, either a Rabi interrogation, in which the interrogation is constantly on for a given duration, and the Ramsey interrogation, in which the atoms are in free evolution separated by two short pi half pulse. And so because of the dead time in the clock cycle, the frequency of the clock laser is actually sampled by the cycle. And so the noise that is measured on P is not directly the noise of the clock laser, but also the high frequency noise of the clock laser that is folded back in the low frequency. And once you plug the servo loop, this high frequency noise imprinted on P just degrades the clock the stability of the clock laser. So that's unfortunate because you have atoms that degrade the performances, at least in the short term, of the clock laser. So to quantify this effect, need to introduce a few quantities. So of course, what is of interest is the frequency noise of the clock laser itself. So the PSD is called S of F. What is important is the clock duty cycle. So it's the ratio between the time the atoms are probed with the clock laser and the total clock cycle. So the smaller the dead time, the closer D is to 1. And the last ingredient is the sensitivity function of the atoms, namely a function that is 0 when the atoms are not probed, and that is 1 when the atoms are probed while they are in the equator of the Bloch sphere. Okay, in between, the sensitivity function is between 0 and 1. So how does that work? So this is a schematic that shows the fluctuation of the clock laser as a function of time. So this would be some kind of, so I filter this fluctuation on a given frequency to make the scheme clear. So here this is frequency fluctuation of the clock laser at a frequency that is quite close to the cycle, the frequency of the cycle of the clock. Now the sensitivity function is not 1 all the time because we have dead time in the clock. It means that actually most of the fluctuation of the clock laser are not seen by the atoms. And here, for instance, the fluctuations would be seen at this point, the next clock cycle at this point, and the next clock cycle at this point. And you see from there that this high frequency noise in the clock laser is sampled at regular intervals, and this high frequency noise is translated into low frequency fluctuations. Okay, and these low frequency fluctuations that were not there in the first place on the clock laser are or transferred back to the clock laser by the servo loop. Now imagine that your duty cycle is much bigger, so closer to 1. The atoms are probed almost all the time. Then all this frequency noise of the clock laser would be somehow averaged out, and the outcome of the measurement would be somewhere here. And in this case, you see that you transfer less high frequency noise to low frequencies. So this was for Ramsey interrogation, so this case here. Now, if we switch to a Rabi interrogation, so Rabi interrogation, the sensitivity is maximum only at the center of the Rabi interrogation. At the edge, the atoms are not yet in the equator of the Bloch sphere, so they are not as sensitive as at the top. So it's kind of a sine arc wave here. And so we are somehow in between these two cases, where we average correctly all the time the clock laser noise, but more at some point than another. So we have an intermediate transfer of high frequency noise to low frequencies. So this is how the Dicke effect is working. And so now we might ask how to get rid of it. So I've enumerated the number of solutions. So the first one I call 0 because it's not such a good solution. The first one is just to integrate. So the Dicke effect is white noise, so it's independent from cycle to cycle. And so if you have your clock running during the night while you sleep, then the problem is solved. You just average out the Dicke effect. Okay, but in the long term, it's not such a clever idea. Maybe there are other ideas. So I have a solution 0b. It's also 0 because it's not perfect. It would mean it would consist in operating two optical clocks in a synchronous way and probed by the same clock laser. So in this way, the Dicke effect would be the same for the two clocks. So when you make the difference between the two clocks, then the Dicke effect cancels out. And so you can make a measurement of the frequency difference between the clocks with without any decay effect. So it's not such a good solution, but it helps characterizing the systematic effect of the clock, but still you don't have a physical clock with a good stability using this method. So here comes a better solution. So solution 1 is to build more stable clock lasers because the decay effect directly comes from the noise of the clock laser. So I will not elaborate on that because next session you will have a discussion about clock lasers. I should still mention some alternative to building clock laser with cavities, which is called spectral hole burning. So the idea is not to use a macroscopic object to stabilize the laser, but rather rare earth ions that are spread in a crystalline matrix at cryogenic temperature. And the fact that it's at cryogenic temperature has two advantages. The first one is that it's possible to create some spectral feature in these ions that are long-lived and that is possible to stabilize on. And also, it also reduces the thermal noise of the system. Okay, and the second solution to try to reduce the decay effect is to improve the dead time of the clock, to reduce the dead time of the clock, so to improve the duty cycle of the clock. So, okay, so how to do that? First step, same as this one, build more stable clock laser. Why is that? Because if your clock laser is more stable, then its current time is longer, and so the time you spend interrogating the atoms is longer, and so the dead time in comparison becomes shorter. Okay, so if you build better laser, you win on the two sides, on the frequency noise of the laser itself, but also on the dead time. But there are also other possibilities. The first one is to use rather a Ramsey interrogation rather than a Rabi interrogation, because we have seen that the sensitivity function is closer to 1 for Ramsey interrogation. So how does it scale? So this is the lambda deviation that corresponds to the decay effect, I say at 1 second, as the function of the duty cycle. So here it's for 0 duty cycle, we probe the atoms almost instantaneously, and 1, there is no dead time in the clock, and you see that the Rabi for Rabi case, there is always a little bit of decay effect, but as the duty cycle goes to 1, then in the Ramsey case, the decay effect goes to 0. So if you are in this configuration where the duty cycle is close to 1, there's a lot to gain to go from Rabi interrogation to Ramsey interrogation. Yes?
Rabi interrogation, you mean a continuous Rabi? Continuous monitoring, or it's also?
Yes, so Rabi interrogation, we drive a pi pulse on the atoms for a given time, but Ramsey is the same duration, but with a fluctuation time t.
It's not continuous monitoring of fluorescence, which is impossible, but in principle it would be possible, maybe. Yeah.
Well, the point that with the Rabi interrogation, basically here and here you don't really monitor the frequency because the atoms are not sensitive. Okay, but on top of that, there is a dead time in the two cases. The second possibility is to implement non-destructive detections. So here the idea is to reduce the dead time of the clocks, because this dead time is there to prepare, to load atoms and to prepare atoms. So if it's possible to detect them without losing them, then next cycle we would spend less time preparing new atoms and be ready to interrogate straight away. Okay, so we have demonstrated such systems. So the main idea would be to have a cavity around the atoms and to inject some light that is resonant with a given transition. And then if you have atoms in the cavity, it would change the optical length of the cavity because the atoms have an index of refraction. And so the position of the resonances of the cavity would move. So how does that help? It's just by monitoring this movement, you can say how many atoms are in the ground state of the clock transition, and then you can measure the transition probability. And because this is a phase measurement and because there is a cavity, it's possible to do so with a very, very small amount of light in the cavity, and so little light that the atom would stay trapped in the optical lattice. Okay, and the last idea is to implement zero dead time clocks. So if you have two clocks, that has been done at NIST with the two ytterbium clocks. If you have two clocks and interrogate them in an interleaved way. So while the atoms are prepared on one clock, the clock laser is probed with Ram's interrogation on the other one. Then with these two clocks, you would effectively build a clock that has 0 dead time, and so you would get a very good stability if compared to another 0 dead time free clock. So I'm done with the decay effect. Now I switch to other noise sources that affect the stability of the clock. So these other noise sources come from the measurement of the translation probability itself. So it doesn't come from the frequency noise of the clock laser, but rather on noise on the measurement of P. So when you measure the translation probability, if you make an error, then via the servo loop, this error will be translated back into an error on the frequency. Okay, quantitatively, the uncertainty on P divided by the uncertainty on omega is just equal to the slope of this resonance, and because the height of the resonance is 1, then the slope is 1 over the width of the resonance. Okay, and from this formula, you can directly deduce the instability associated to that. So if you write 1 over SNR, the noise and the probability, then you deduce the noise on omega just by multiplying by delta omega, which is there. And because we usually speak in relative units, so here it's not sigma omega we are interested in, but sigma y, so omega over omega naught, then you have to divide by omega naught. So this is the one-shot standard deviation. I mean, if you want to write the Allen deviation, assuming it's white noise, then you have to divide by the square root of the number of measurements, which is just the square root of the cycle time divided by the time you spend integrating. So this is the formula for the instability of a clock that would be limited by noise on the measurement process of the probability. So how to improve or to improve the stability, to reduce the effect of these noise sources? The first one is to increase the frequency of the clock translation itself. So that's why we are building optical clocks, because the frequency is quite large. The other possibility is to reduce the line width, so make a sharper resonance. So it means increasing the probe time, so building better lasers with better coherence time. And of course, the last solution is to increase the SNR. So it's always easy to say, but hard to achieve, because to increase the SNR, you have to understand the noise sources and to correct for them. So these sources can be, for instance, the detection noise. If your detection system had have some noise, then this noise will be imprinted back on the frequency. But it's usually not a problem, especially with the cavity-assisted detections, which have a very good signal-to-noise ratio. The other one that I want to discuss in more detail is the quantum projection noise, because it's a fundamental limit in optical clocks. So what is it about? It's just that I said that to make the error signal, we have to measure the translation probability. But translation probability is not a quantum observable. What is a quantum observable is rather this operator, EE, which projects the atom in the excited state of the clock transition. And because it is a quantum measurement, then it has a probabilistic outcome. So let's see how it works. So let's assume that the interaction between the clock laser and the atoms drive the wave function of the atoms into a quantum superposition of the ground and excited state of the clock transition. And let's assume now that you have only one atom. So the result you get is, when you apply this measurement operator, is 1 with a probability 1/2, or 0, ground state, with a probability 1/2. So in the end, the signal-to-noise ratio is just 1/2. The signal is 1 and the noise is 1/2. Okay, now let's assume that you have a large number of atoms. Then the wave function of all the atoms would be the tensor product of the independent function of each atom. And so each atom would randomly project either in the excited state or the ground state. And so the result would be a binomial distribution, which has an average of n over 2. Basically, half of the atom will project in the ground state and half in the excited state, but with a deviation which is on the order of the square root of the number of atoms. So in the end, the signal-to-noise ratio, so the signal is n, the noise is the square root of n, so the signal-to-noise ratio is 1 over square root of n. Now you plug this in the formula of the last slide, and then you get the instability of the clock limited by the quantum projection noise. That has this formula. So you recognize the quality factor of the clock transition, but now you have a square root of the number of atoms. So to overcome this quantum projection noise, the idea is to increase the number of atoms, because the larger the number of atoms, the lower the instability. But of course, at some point, you have problems with collisions between atoms. So another way to go around the quantum projection noise is to try to investigate speed squeezing techniques of the atomic ensemble. So the main idea is that to derive the formula for the quantum projection noise, we assumed that the wave function of the atoms was the tensor product of independent wave functions. So if you break this assumption, you break the demonstration you break the proof of the quantum projection noise, and it's possible to go beyond. So this would mean building a non-factorizable state of the atomic ensemble. So let's see how quantitatively this helps. So there is an analogy between the clock transition, so a two-level system with a spin 1/2 that I note S. Now, if you have n atoms in the clock, then you can introduce the total spin of the atom, J, which is the sum of the individual spins. Okay, now if you assume that you have a large number of atoms and that all the atoms are excited more or less in the same way by the clock laser, then you can choose a direction Z in which all the spin points. And because you have a large number of atoms, this J would be somehow a classical variable with a length n/2. And now you have to remember the commutation relation between the component of an angular momentum, which is this one. Now if you replace J by the classical value, you end up with a commutator that is I times a real number. And it means that these two variables have to satisfy the Heisenberg inequality. So the product of the uncertainty on the two variables must be larger than something that multiplied by the commutator. Now the state that we introduce here to derive the quantum projection noise would be, in this picture, a coherent state, meaning a state that has equal uncertainty on these two variables. But now if you are able to, so it's represented here, so in the Bloch sphere, this would be this uncertainty area which has the same size on the x direction and the y direction. But now if you are able to introduce nonlinear interaction between the atoms, then you are able to unbalance this relation, meaning that on one axis, you would have a lower uncertainty than the quantum projection noise at the expense that on the other axis, you would have a larger uncertainty. But if you manage to orientate the ellipse such that the synaxis is on the axis on which you measure, then you can go below the quantum projection noise. So how much is it possible to improve? Well, it's possible to improve as long as this hypothesis is still valid. That is at the basis of our demonstration. So it's valid until the size of the ellipsis is just as big as the sphere. And the sphere being of size n, so the maximum squeezing you can get is 1/n. Okay, so this is very promising to go around the quantum projection noise, but it has still to be demonstrated with optical transition, and especially with optical transition that are used as a real clock. Okay, so let me conclude the part about the stability with an example. So for now, the optical lattice clocks are limited by the Dicke effect, so the effect of the frequency noise of the clock laser, but they are not yet limited by the quantum projection noise. And the best stability demonstrated for now is reported in this Allen deviation, what comes from the strontium clock at GILA from this year. And they were able to, by comparing two clocks, to show that the instability of a single clock would be something like 6⁻⁻17 at 1 second, which is an incredible achievement. And it means that after only less than 1 hour, it's possible to measure the frequency difference and then to characterize the systematic effects down to 10⁻18. So this kind of curve is enabled by a very recent improvement in the clock laser. So the first technique was to have long cavities, so 40 centimeters, that is demonstrated at NIST, at PTB, at GILA, in Japan, at RIKEN, that enabled stabilities in the low 10⁻16. with two clocks working in parallel, so some kind of zero dead time free clock that I introduced in the first slide. At NIST, they were able to estimate the single clock uncertainty at 6 × 10⁻17, and this curve was obtained with a cryogenic silicon cavity that was developed in collaboration with GILA and PTB in the mid 10⁻17. It's still not quite at the quantum projection noise, which is at 2 × 10⁻17. Okay, so we have to understand also that the quantum projection noise is a moving target, so it depends on the quality factor of the resonance. So the better the clock laser, the better the quality factor, and so the lower the quantum projection noise. So as the laser improves to reach this quantum projection noise, the quantum projection noise itself will decrease. Okay, I'm done with the stability. So I'm switching to accuracy. So this is a clock comparison that has been achieved at NIST between two ytterbium clocks, and at RIKEN in Japan between two cryogenic strontium clocks. And the accuracy that is reported for these clocks is 1.8 × 10⁻18 for ytterbium clock, and 7.2 × 10⁻18 for the strontium clock. And what is really crucial for these two reports is that they have two clocks, and they have been able to compare them together and actually show that the frequency of the clock agree within this uncertainty. So the ytterbium clock at NIST exhibited a frequency difference that is below 10⁻18 with a total systematic uncertainty of 8 × 10⁻19. So it's a bit lower than the single clock uncertainty because there are systematic effects in common mode between the two clocks. And at RIKEN, they were able to measure the frequency difference between their strontium clock at something like 5 × 10⁻18. So to achieve this result, it's necessary to estimate all the perturbing effects that can move the frequency of the clock, and that's the aim of the accuracy budget. So going through all these effects and try to evaluate them. So this is what I'm going to do with you in the next slides, but I will not give you more numbers than that. So my point is just to go through the physics of the effects. If you want numbers, you have to remember that all the systematic effects now, all in these clocks, are estimated at 10⁻18 or below. So even though these performances are very good, there are perspectives. So as the clock laser and the stability of the clocks improve, it's faster and faster to characterize systematic effects. So there are perspectives to improve this accuracy budget even below 10⁻18 in the 10⁻19 range. Still, the blackbody radiation shift, even for these cryogenic clocks, remains one of the main limitations. So here, a specific treatment has to be employed because it's not by integrating more that it's possible to estimate better the blackbody radiation shift. So we'll come to that later. So I will start with a few systematic effects. So the first one are the motional effects. So this is a reminder because you have seen all the detailed calculation in the first lecture by Mirao. But this is the result of this calculation. So if you have a free atom with a velocity v that is probed by the clock laser with wave vector k, then you get a number of systematic effects that are associated with the energy of the atom. So the energy is the internal energy plus the kinetic energy of the atom. And the systematic effects are due to the momentum acquired by the atom after the absorption of the photon. So there are three effects. So the first one is the first order Doppler effect, which depends on the velocity of the atoms. So the relative frequency shift is v/c. There is the recoil shift that corresponds to the absorption of the momentum. So here it's a fixed value that does not depend on the velocity. And there is a relativistic effect, which is the second order Doppler effect due to the time dilation. And it gives a relative frequency shift on the order of v/c squared. So all these effects combined means that when you probe the atom, so this is a transition probability as a function of the detuning between the clock laser and the atom. So 0 means clock laser at resonance. You have a broadening of the resonance, which is the Doppler broadening, and a shift of the center of the resonance, which is the recoil shift. So of course, the solution to get rid of this Doppler effect. So the microwave clocks have been working hard to try to mitigate these effects, but even after significant work, it's really hard to go beyond 10^-16. So it's really important to get rid of them for optical clocks. And the way to do that is to confine the atoms. So now the atoms are not free, but they are in a quantum potential with the veils. And now what you observe when you probe the atom with the clock laser, basically is the same Doppler effect and the same Doppler profile, so with the recoil shift and the Doppler broadening. But in this Doppler profile, you slice resonances, meaning that you can find a resonance that is unperturbed. And this is associated with the fact that now the energy levels do not depend on the velocity anymore, but are discrete levels. So are we done now that we have confined the atom? So what is left? So there are basically two sources of motional effects remaining. The first one is the fact that the atoms are trapped in an optical lattice. So it means that there is a band structure. So the solution for that is twofold. There are two possibilities. Either to use a vertical lattice. So you have seen the Wannier-Stark states in the previous lecture that lifts the degeneracy between sides of the lattice and that kill the band structure associated to it. And the second one, which has been proposed by Junier's group at GILA, is to somehow make a lattice with a pitch that matches the pitch of the wavelength of the clock laser. So if you go back here, if you have a lattice, then you have a band structure, meaning that the levels here are not infinitely thin, but have some thickness, which is the thickness of the bands of the lattice. But now, if the momentum acquired by the atoms under the absorption of the clock laser is exactly the pitch of the lattice, then you don't move in the band, and so you have no effect due to the band structure. Second thing that is left is the second order Doppler effect. So it's an effect that is on the order of v squared over c squared. So the atoms have an average squared velocity in the optical lattice, but still it's easy to estimate. It depends on the oscillation frequency on the lattice, the mass of the atoms. If you put numbers, you realize that it's really small, perhaps below 10 to the minus 21. So I'm done with motional effect. Now I switch to the interaction between the atoms and their environment. Oops, sorry. So this is the unperturbed atom, ground state and excited state. And now if you place the atom in an electric field, due to the Stark shift, so static electric field, the energy difference between the two levels will shift by a quantity delta omega. This effect is quadratic in electric field, and the order of magnitude, if you take strontium, for instance, is something like 10 to the minus 14 for an electric field of 1 kilovolt per meter. So 1 kilovolt per meter can sound quite large, but it's actually not. It's very easy to have kilovolt per meter just by combing your hair, for instance. So we have to take care about these effects. So we have been actually able to observe this effect in our strontium clocks at CERT. So this is the frequency difference between the two strontium clocks measured over something like several months. And you see at the beginning the frequency difference is 10 to the minus 13. Okay, and that was due to the fact that we had some charges trapped around the atoms, and the charges would produce an electric field which would shift the resonance. And now, because it's UHV and because the conductivity of optic grade optics is very, very small, then it would take something like 1 year to discharge, time constant between 1 year. So to reach 10 minus 18, I let you calculate how long you would have to wait. So fortunately, it's possible to discharge faster. And this is a curve we took. So I remember taking this curve. I was sitting in front of the experiment with Michao, our host, and we shown UV light from a UV gun used to glue UV glue. And after shining the UV gun for 30 seconds, we could see the frequency difference between the clocks moving from 5 10 to the minus 14 to 3 10 to the minus 14. Okay, and after something like 1 night of UV, all the charges were gone, and so we were able to get rid of this effect. But of course, it's not enough to observe the effect. You have to quantify it. So this is a way to quantify this effect. So the idea is that you have the atoms here. You bring an electrode close to the atoms, and you measure the frequency of the clock transition when switching between plus V and minus V on the electrode, so two opposite voltage, which means that you would create close to the atoms an electric field that has an opposite sign, but the same magnitude. And because they have the same magnitude and the effect is quadratic, then the frequency shift that you would observe by applying the electric field would be the same, independent of the sign of the voltage you apply on the electrode. But now let's assume that you have a spurious electric field due to some static charges. Then this spurious field would unbalance the electric field between the two configurations of the electrodes. So in a sense, it would move this parabola. And so when you switch between plus V and minus V, then you would observe a frequency difference. And from this frequency difference, you are able to estimate what is the uncertainty on the frequency shift. So fortunately, with UV light, it's quite easy to bring this effect down to below 10 to the minus 18. So are there other possibilities to get rid of this effect? The main idea is to surround the atom with conductive materials. So either with shielding. So for instance, here, if you have a piece of glass with charges on it, and you put a cap on the optics, that has a depth that is comparable with its diameter, then you can show that the electric field is very, very efficiently shielded. So it's possible to damp the electric field between inside and outside by orders of magnitude. The other technique would be to make the optical surfaces conductive using this indium tin oxide coatings. So this is a vacuum chamber that has been designed at NIST, and all the mirrors are coated with this conductive coating, and so this effectively builds a Faraday cage around the atoms, which helps getting rid of electric fields. So now we do the same with the magnetic field. So you have the unperturbed atom. The unperturbed atom is surrounded by the magnetic field B, and so the frequency of the resonance changes. So now there are two components. The first one is the linear Zeeman effects. So for optical lattice clocks, the fermionic isotopes that are used have a nuclear spin that is non-zero, and so they have a frequency shift that depends on the magnetic level, on the difference between the Landé factor of the clock states and on the magnetic field. So how to get rid of this effect? So the idea is to introduce on purpose a bias field B to lift the degeneracy between all these magnetic sublevels. And then, since this effect is symmetric in M, so it's opposite when you switch from N to minus M, then it's possible to cancel it by averaging the two clock transition plus MF or minus MF. Okay, but this requires a number of experimental procedures, namely to optically pump the atom in one of these magnetic sublevels. The second part of this interaction between a static B field and the atoms is the quadratic Zeeman effect. So we have a frequency shift that is proportional to B squared. And so this one cannot be cancelled, so we have to be measured and subtracted from the clock transition. So this is a measurement of such an effect. So this is the frequency difference between two strontium clocks as a function of the magnetic field in Gauss. And because it's possible to induce very large magnetic field and the effect is quadratic, then it's possible to really observe this parabola and to measure its curvature very precisely. So the way to mitigate this effect, of course, is to try to go to the lowest possible magnetic field in order to have a small effect and then to have a small uncertainty on the effect. The trade-off being line pulling, because if the magnetic field is too close, then the degeneracy between the lines is not well lifted and you can have contamination between the lines. I'm continuing on the interaction between the atom and external electromagnetic wave, but now I consider AC fields, so electromagnetic waves. And this is the way this wave interacts with the atom. So you still have the ground and the excited state of of the clock transition, the clock laser with a possible detuning. But now you have to consider an ancillary state, so another state in the atomic structure of the atoms, and then this external electromagnetic wave may interact with this transition between, for instance, the excited state of the clock transition and this other state. And this interaction makes a frequency shift that is proportional to the intensity of the electromagnetic wave, and that is inversely proportional to the square of the detuning with the transition. So what are the sources for this electromagnetic wave? So you can have, for instance, stray laser light on the atoms. So it's easy to fix. The way to fix it is just to switch off the light. Okay? When the atoms are probed by the clock laser, you have to really make sure that all the laser beams are tightly shut off by mechanical shutter, so that there is absolutely no light going to the atoms. However, there are three kinds of light that are not possible to switch off, and so you have to live with it. And the first one is the light for the optical lattice. So it's a light that traps the atoms. Of course, you need it during the clock interrogation, otherwise you would not be in the Lambda regime. The second line that you cannot switch off is the clock laser itself. Okay, so you use the clock laser to probe the clock transition, so it has to be on during the clock transition. And the last one you cannot switch off is the black body radiation emitted by the environment of the atoms. Okay, and in the next few slides, I will focus on these three aspects. So the first one is the lattice light shift. So I remember that in an optical lattice clock, the atoms are trapped in a laser standing wave with this kind of potential. So it's a dipole force that makes that the atoms are stuck in the intensity maxima of the standing wave. Now the problem that you face is that in order to fight gravity and to effectively trap the atoms and also to be in the Lambda regime, you need quite a large power. For instance, for strontium, if you want to have a Lambda parameter as low as 0.22, you need something like 10 watts of optical power. And this optical power induces a very large light shift on the clock transition, which is on the order of several megahertz. Okay, so it's something like 10 to the minus 8 of the clock frequency, which is 10 orders of magnitude worse than what you expect for these clocks. The second difficulty is that this light shift may depend on the polarization of the trapping light itself. And so if the polarization of the light is fluctuating, then this light shift of several megahertz may change with time. And so the solution for this that's been invented by Professor Katori in the early 2000s is the magic wavelength. So it's a wavelength for the trapping light, for optical lattice, for which the polarizability, so this is the light shift or polarizability of the clock state, this is the ground state, this is the excited clock state, and for a given wavelength, these two polarizabilities or the two light shifts, they match, and so there is no net effect on the clock transition. But there is also another ingredient that solves the second issue, which is that the transition that is used for the clock has to be isotropic. So it has to be a polarization insensitive transition, meaning that you have to probe a state with j equals 0 to j equals 0. So it's the case for alkaline earth atoms that have an angular momentum j equals 0 in the two clock states. So it's almost, because this consideration neglects the angular momentum of the nucleus of the atoms. So let's be a bit more quantitative, and let's write the frequency shift induced by the light on the atoms at the first order, at the first order of the electric dipole approximation. So I would need a few notations. So here on this axis, I show the wave vector of the optical lattice. So here the optical lattice would be vertical. Here I introduce the bias field that is used to leave the degeneracy between the M states. And in yellow, in purple, is the polarization of the optical lattice that has to be orthogonal to the K vector, but can have some ellipticity psi. And now you can write the light shift as a function of the trap depth, so it's basically the intensity of the optical lattice, in the form of 3 parameters, so the scalar, the vector, and the tensor term. So these terms, they bear all the dependence of the light shift as a function of the polarization of the optical lattice. So the first one is the scalar, so it's one that does not depend on the polarization, and we, by definition, at the magic wavelengths, this scalar shift is 0, because the polarizability, the static polarizability of the 2 clock states is 0. Now the second part is a vector shift. So the vector shift acts like a magnetic field. So you see it's proportional to the M state. And it's there only if you have some elliptical polarization and if the magnetic field is non-orthogonal to the wave vector of the lattice. So this one is fairly easy to eliminate just by using linear light, by using B in the XY plane, and finally by averaging between the opposite MF sets, which we do anyway to cancel the magnetic field. So this one just goes away. And the last one is the tensor shift. So this one is a shift that depends on the polarization of the lattice, so specifically on the angle between the polarization vector and the magnetic field. And so this one introduces an effect that is similar to the scalar one, so it's possible to get rid of it just by detuning a bit the frequency of the lattice from the wavelength of the lattice from the magic wavelengths. So this is well under control, but there are a few challenges to consider. The first one is that you can experience deviation from the magic wavelengths. For instance, if the light source you use for the optical lattice is not spectrally pure, you might have spectral components that are not at the magic wavelengths, and that would restore a bit of this scalar shift. Then you can face fluctuation of the polarization of the optical lattice. So here you have the magic wavelength that you have to choose depends on the polarization. If the polarization changes, then the E1 shift changes. So this is true only for species that have a nuclear spin larger than 1/2, because if the nuclear spin is 1/2, the case for ytterbium and mercury, for instance, there is no tensor shift. And finally, I think the most critical aspect in evaluating the lattice light shift is temperature effect. So here I write U naught, the depth of the lattice, but this depth is very easy to estimate. It's just related to the oscillation frequency of the atoms in the optical lattice. But now, in an optical lattice formed by standing laser wave, the trap is not exactly harmonic. There is a small anharmonicity in the trap, meaning that the oscillation frequency would depend a bit on the temperature of the atoms. So it is necessary to very precisely characterize the temperature of the atoms in order to be able to know what trap depth has to be input in this equation. So it's not the end of the story about light shift. So this was just the first order approximation. Now we have to move to higher orders because this one is very heavily suppressed. So the higher orders become relevant. And the first one, the first effect I want to consider is multiphoton processes. So the lattice light might interact with the atoms by absorbing more than one photon from the lattice. And so this would effectively give a frequency shift that is proportional to the square of the intensity, so the square of the trap depth. So this is for real. I mean, this is the frequency of a strontium clock as a function of the trap depth. So it's quite large trap depth, but anyway it's achievable. And you can see that there is a clear parabolic behavior of the frequency with the intensity, which is a trace of these multiphoton processes. So here you would see, for instance, a small slope at the origin, which would be because we are not exactly at the magic wavelengths, and then this curvature that would take over as fast as after a few hundreds of energy recoils. Okay, it's really important to take into account this effect. Let's assume you didn't measure this point, and you put a straight line here. Okay, you would end up here, whereas the end part of frequency is there. So it would be a huge effect. So how to deal with it? Well, there's no way, and we cannot cancel it, so the only way is to measure it precisely and to correct for it, just like, for instance, the quadratic Zeeman effect. The catch being that for some atoms, and especially for ytterbium, there is a strong dependence of this curvature with the polarization of the lattice. So if the polarization of the lattice is changing, then this estimate might change with time. And finally, it's really important to measure because it's very hard for theoreticians to estimate what will be the value for this for this beta coefficient, so the two-photon processes. And especially, there are still some very clever people that are able to give orders of magnitude, but there is still significant mismatch with experiments.
Question?
Yes.
So when you measure with a very shallow lattice,
Yes.
is it not difficult to hold the atoms if the lattice is very shallow?
Well,
Your error should be...
The point here, here the scale goes to 3,000 recoils, so it's way larger than what you need to run the clock. To run the clock, we usually do it at less than 100 recoils, which is okay, is enough to be in the lambda regime. But some groups are pursuing probing atoms with even lower trap depths. So the reason for that is that the lattice, in addition to introducing light shift, it also reduces the lifetime of the excited state. Okay, there are some Raman transition between the excited state and the ground state due to the photon of the lattice. And so to get rid of that and enable second length coherence time between the atoms and the clock laser, you will have to go to something like 10 recoils or so. Okay, I think 10 recoils is something like the limit, because at 10 recoils you start to have only one level in the optical lattice. Okay, we are not done with lattice light shift, so it's quite a complicated topic. The last part is the multipolar effects. So we have seen the E1 potential, so electric dipole potential, but there is a whole Taylor series of this that characterize the interaction between light and atoms that have to be considered. So here I draw the E1 potential. So it's a lattice, so it's a sine wave. So I draw only one period of the sine wave formed by the lattice for the ground and the excited state. Okay, so the potential is something like minus u naught times the cosine square. So KL is the wave vector of the lattice. So now we have seen that at the magic wavelength for the E1 potential, then the trap depth for the ground and excited state is the same. So if I plot the same for the excited state, it will be exactly the same shape. Okay, so here, between here and here, you will have the unperturbed frequency. Now you have the lattice, but because the polarizability is the same, trap depth is the same, then the distance between here and here is also unperturbed. So there is no effect on the clock transition. But now if you look at any of these levels, the distance between a level for a motional level for the ground state and the same motional level for the excited state is also unperturbed. So everything is fine. But now you have to introduce multipolar effects. So for instance, the dipole magnetic interaction and the electric quadrupole interaction. But the point is that these interactions, they do not vary like cosine square, they vary like sine square. The reason for that is if you have a standing wave where the electric field is maximum, the magnetic field is minimum. Okay, so the M1 effect is just 0 when the E1 is large, and is large when the E1 is 0. It's the same for the E2 interaction because it depends on the gradient of the electric field. So here the electric field is flat, so the E2 would be 0. So what does it do on the trapping potential? So basically you add another potential, but now that has an opposite phase with respect to the E1 potential. And so what it does is that in the end, it does not change the bottom of the trap, okay, because at the bottom of the trap there is no the M1 and E2 are 0, but it somehow changes the curvature of the optical lattice. And if it changes the curvature, it means that if you take any of these levels, then the energy difference between this level and this level will not be the unperturbed frequency anymore. So with this picture, you can quantify the energy shift, which would be proportional to the square root of the intensity multiplied by factors that depend on the temperature of the atoms. Okay, so there are two problems with this frequency shift. The first one is that it goes like the square root of u. So having a very large lattice to have a big lever arm on U would not help so much because of the slow increase of the square root of U. The second one is that it depends strongly on the temperature of the atom, so if the temperature changes, then this effect might change. And finally, it's not possible to compensate it by tuning the trap frequency, because if you change the trap depth here for one of the states, then you would not induce the same shift on all the levels. So this effect is quite small. It's okay for 10 to the minus 18, but if you want to go better than 10 to the minus 18, it's required to very precisely estimate this effect. Especially, there is an interesting mismatch between the theoretical estimate for M1 and E2 and the one that is measured by Professor Katori on the strontium. Even the sign is not the same. So there is some physics to understand at this level.
Sorry, just
Yes?
one question. At the beginning, you mentioned that for the E1 potential, you have the same potential, so the energy would be exactly the same, always
Yes.
the same. But on the other hand, because of the tiny mass difference,
Because of the?
because of the tiny mass difference between the two energy states, having the same potential would lead to a small change in the frequency at the bottom, and hence the spacing of the, so really the h bar omega, the energy that you have. So what I'm trying to say is that the energy in this potential for the two excited states, if the potential were exactly the same, the energy would not be the same. And if you do the calculation, maybe it's not relevant now, but maybe in the
Yes, that's interesting, but I wonder if it's not just including the whole package of magic wavelengths, meaning that when you tune the magic wavelengths, you would not be tuned to the one that has the same energy, but the one that has the same...
yeah, so we could maybe discuss that. Yeah. It's true that, one might think that understand the condition that could...
But I'm not sure about my answer because I have not thought about that yet, so, but yes.
Well, no, but it's true at this point, I thought a little bit about that, and it's true that it might be in some cases that, so maybe we can discuss that later. I think it might make a difference whether you use a Rete tuned or Houde tuned lattice. And in some cases, I seem to remember that yes, you would just not notice, and when you look for the magic wavelength, it will be taken into account. But depending on the situation, that would not happen. We can maybe
Okay,
discuss that later.
thank you. So we have seen many different light shifts due to the optical lattice, and now we might ask, what if we pack them together? Okay, so the E1, the E2, the M1, the hyperposability. So we, in the end, got a very complex dependence of the frequency with the trap depth. So this is a picture I got from a paper by Katori, which shows the lattice light shift as a function of the laser intensity. And so you have all these different regimes, one that goes like the square root, one that goes like the intensity, one that goes like the square of the intensity, so the hyperposability, but also one that goes like the power 3/2, which is due to a temperature effect. And then if you combine all them together, you would have this funny shape. And it's really important to quantify all these effects together to understand how the curve is going. For instance, here if you sit on this red curve, but would just take measure points here, and then and extrapolate, you would just end up here, whereas the correct interpolation would be there. So it's really important to measure very precisely all these polarizabilities. And because of this complex behavior, it's also possible to find some operational points, so special wavelengths and special intensity for which the frequency of the clock transition would be somehow much insensitive to the latest intensity, but also would match the magic wavelengths, I mean the unperturbed transition. Okay, I'm moving to the other kind of light shift that I've mentioned in the first slide, which is the light shift induced by the clock laser itself. So of course there is no shift due to the interaction between the clock transition itself because we are at resonance, so by definition the light shift is 0. But there is a shift due to the interaction between the clock laser and the other transition of the atom. So let me give an example. If you take fermionic strontium isotope, so the line is allowed by the hyperfine interaction between nucleus and the electrons. And this hyperfine interaction is strong enough such that you don't need so much light to drive the atomic transition. the order of magnitude of this light shift would be 10 to the minus 19. Okay, basically it's really off-resonant light with very, very little intensity, so the shift is quite small. However, there are a number of cases for which this laser light shift, clock laser light shift, cannot be neglected. The first one is for Ramsey interrogation. So for Ramsey interrogation, you have to so you have two pulses at the beginning and at the end of the interrogation that have quite a large intensity in order to be able to drive pi-half pulse. Okay, and so if you have a Ramsey interrogation, this shift can be, for instance, 10 times bigger if there is a ratio of 10 between the duration of the free evolution of the atoms and the length of the pi-half pulse. The other case where this shift has to be considered is for bosonic isotopes. So bosonic isotopes have zero nuclear spin, so there is no hyperfine interaction to drive the transition. But it's still possible to probe the clock transition by inducing a finite lifetime for the clock transition with a B field. And but the strength of this transition induced by the B field is still limited, and so you need quite a large amount of power in order to be able to observe the clock transition. So in the end, there is a kind of trade-off between the magnitude of the B field and the light shift, the intensity of the light that you are willing to put on the atoms. And there are also some specific transitions, different from the one from the strontium, where you need a large intensity in order to drive the transition. So I'm thinking about the clock transition in ytterbium ions, for which this laser light shift is really a critical issue. So how to get rid of this light shift? So there are two possibilities. The first one, again, we'll see with Fritz next time, is to build better lasers, because if the laser is better, then the interrogation time is longer, and so the power you have to put on the atoms is lower, and so there is less light shift. Okay, but if the shift is still too large, then there are some nice techniques which are called hyper-Ramsey, and there are many variants of them that has been developed at PTB, at NPL, and also in France. And this consists in modified Ramsey interrogation. So in Ramsey interrogation, you would have one pi-half pulse and one pi-half pulse, and the idea is to add some interrogation window inside the Ramsey sequence, and the phase of this interrogation window would be engineered such that the effect of a light shift moving the phase of the atom would be compensated, so it would move on one side on one part of the sequence, but then on the other side for one other part of the clock sequence. And with this sequence, it's possible to dramatically reduce the impact of the light shift of the clock laser. Okay, I'm moving to the last systematic effect we see together. I'm starting to believe you're a bit bored, so I will not go through the whole list, but I will stop with this one, which is quite interesting. So the blackbody radiation shift. So this shift comes from the fact that the atoms are surrounded by an environment, and this environment emits radiation, which is in the infrared domain of the spectrum at room temperature. So this is a symbol I use. So here there is an arrow that shows the light that is emitted by a part of the vacuum system to the atoms. And if you look at an element of surface of the surrounding of the atom, then it would emit a flux of power that is proportional to the square, to power 4 of the temperature, the Stefan constant, and some constant that is characteristic of the material. So the nature of the material, the weight polish, which is called the emissivity. So it's the deviation from of the material from a black body. And this light that arrives on the atom induces a frequency shift that depends on the total power that is seen by the atoms, but also on the polarizability of the atoms. So in order to estimate this effect, there are two problems to solve. The first one is to estimate the flux phi that arrives on the atoms. And you see here that there is a challenge, which is this parameter epsilon, because the flux depends on the type of the material, and this emissivity is really very hard to estimate precisely for a given material. Fortunately, physics come to the rescue, and it's not only the light that is emitted by a part of the vacuum system that you have to consider, but also the light that is reflected that is emitted by other part of the vacuum system and reflected by this element of surface. And the point that there is a theorem, which is called the Kirchhoff theorem, that says that for any material, the emissivity, the sum of the emissivity coefficient and the reflection is always 1. Okay, it's necessary. The way to prove it that if you don't have this relation, then you would violate the second principle of thermodynamics. And so with this relation, then you can show that as long as the temperature of the environment is homogeneous, then the flux phi that comes from blackbody radiation does not depend at all on the nature of the materials around the atoms, nor on the geometry of the system around the atoms. And the total flux that arrive on the atoms would be just sigma times T to the 4. Okay, so this equality is really crucial. Without that, it would not be possible to reach the accuracy that now we have on the clocks. However, this is assuming that the temperature is homogeneous. What if there is some inhomogeneity in the temperature, delta T, or an uncertainty on the measurement of the temperature? So this uncertainty delta T is what limits the accuracy, or the precision with which we can correct for the blackbody radiation. So there are several techniques to go around that. The first one is just to bound this uncertainty delta T. So for instance, if you are sure that the total environment of the atoms has a temperature that is lower than Tmax and smaller than Tmin, but no other information about the distribution, then you can say that the uncertainty, the 1 sigma uncertainty, would be Tmax minus Tmin divided by square root of 12. So then the idea is to try to build an environment for which Tmax is the closer possible to Tmin. The other possibility is to model the environment. So this is a finite element study that has been performed here in FAMO that models the temperature distribution of a vacuum system for strontium atoms. And assuming some emissivity for the materials, it can somehow calculate the exact flux that arrive on the atoms. The last possibility, not the last one, next possibility is to try to measure the flux nearby the position of the atom. So this is an experiment that was done at GILA, in which they put a thermal probe that can be placed where the atoms are, and if this probe is well designed, then it would be representative of the flux that arrive on the atoms themselves. Okay, and the last possibility, of course, is to cool down. So it goes like T to the 4, so the uncertainty goes like T to the 3. And so if you go to cryogenic temperatures, then you dramatically reduce the effect. So this is an experiment that was done in Katowice group at Lichen, in which they have a cryogenic nozzle and they move the atoms into the nozzle, and here they are shielded from the black body of the environment. The difficulty being that making the lattice move may introduce some systematic effects in the measurement. Okay, so the second problem about blackbody radiation is to estimate the polarizability alpha. So alpha is actually the differential polarizability between the excited and the ground state. So it's related to the static polarizability of the two levels, excited and ground state, plus some dynamic parts. So the reason for that here, it's a spectrum I've taken from this paper. So it shows basically the polarizability of the ground and excited state as a function of the frequency of the light. So it's so blue is for the ground state, red is for the excited state, and in green here is a distribution of the spectrum of the black body. So you can see that the black body is sufficiently low frequency so that the polarizability of the atoms in the main part of the spectrum of the black body is almost identical to the static polarizability of the atoms. But still, there is a correction to apply to the polarizability to take into account the dynamic part of the polarizability. So here is how it's done. So this is an experiment that was done at PTB on the strontium clock to measure the static polarizability. So the idea is to build a very precise capacitor in order to apply a very precise electric field on the atoms and to measure the frequency shift by the Stark effect induced by the electric field on the atoms. So with that, it's possible to very precisely measure the differential polarizability. And then what's that to estimate the dynamic part? So it's typically a few percent of the static part. And for this, it's necessary to know the atomic properties of the atom, meaning a precise measurement of the lifetime of some excited state in the structure. So this is an experiment that was done at NIST with ytterbium, in which they populate excited states, and then they measure the decay rate of these states. From this decay rate, they can deduce the oscillator strength of the transitions, and then deduce the shape of the dynamic polarizability. A complementary option is to try to choose an atomic species that has intrinsically a low polarizability. So for optical lattice clock, it's the case, for instance, for mercury and and for cadmium. And there is a notable example for the ion clocks, which is aluminium, that has accidentally a very, very low static polarizability. Okay, so I could go on quite for a long time, but probably you're a bit annoyed, and anyway now it was late when I prepared that yesterday evening, so I stopped there. But there are a long list of very interesting effects that you could consider. So the most interesting probably is called collisions. So it's the fact that for some lattice geometry you can have several atoms at the same site of lattice, and these atoms would start to interact and produce some frequency shift. So the way around that, of course, is to reduce the density, but also to try this hyper-Ramsey stuff. They can also have an impact on the cold collisions. The atoms in the optical lattice can also collide with background gas. So if you have residual pressure in the vacuum system, but here it's quite easy to deal because there is a relation between the lifetime of the trapped atoms and the frequency shift that you have to correct. The only catch is that this relation depends on the species that you have in the vacuum system, so you have somehow to precisely estimate the composition of the gas in the vacuum system. Then you have some technical effects, so some line pooling due to the presence of nearby lines. You have to also consider phase chop in acoustic modulator. So when you switch on AOMs to drive the clock transition, then there is some thermal effect in the AOMs that introduce some phase shift. You have to measure the height of the clock in order to estimate the gravitational shift and so on. But there are also these are fancy effects, but there are also some technical problems that happens. Okay, and they happens quite often in my experience. So you can have, for instance, ground loops. You can have perturbation on the frequency of the clock laser that are not random, that are kind of systematic, and that introduce a shift. And sometimes you don't know what's happening. Okay, this is a bit disappointing because metrology is about understanding everything. But I think that many of the people that build this clock, at some point there is a point they don't understand. Okay, so here everything seems to be clean, but from time to time you have to consider these effects. Okay, so I have a few minutes for the last part of the talk, which is applications. So you have seen applications in fundamental physics, so this is just a reminder. So it's possible with clock to probe quantum mechanics, for instance, with the effect of cold collision. So this is a graph that was taken with the GLAS strontium clock, and you see here that the line they observe is really distorted, and the distortion comes from the collisions between strontium atoms. So it's really possible to probe the physics of cold collisions with these very precise clocks. It's also possible to detect gravitational effects and relativistic effects. So for instance, here this was an aluminium clock at NIST. So they have a pair of clocks, they lifted one of them and they could observe the gravitational shift between the clocks. And it's also possible to measure the drift of fundamental constants and put bounds to theory beyond the standard model. So you have seen this application. I will not go through them, but I would like to stress one of the applications of optical clock, which is clock comparisons. And I would emphasize that these clock comparisons are essential to prove that the performances of the clock that we realize is the one that we claim. So it's really when you compare clocks that you are sure that the systematic effects are really under control. So historically, when you look at the first optical clocks, the only way to compare them was to compare different clocks in different laboratories was to measure them against the cesium clock. So this is, for instance, the frequency of the strontium so in hertz, in SI hertz, so as compared to the cesium. And there have been measurements of this frequency by many different laboratories over the year, and they all agree very well. So this was the first guess that really the optical clocks were as good as they claimed, so were better than the cesium clocks. So it was possible that different teams could reproduce these clocks very well. But then, as time passes by, the optical clocks improved, and then we are really limited by the cesium clocks. So for this, it's really important to develop direct comparison between optical clocks. So this is a list of comparison between optical clocks happening in the same lab. So you see there are more and more frequent. The first one was with a very nice result they had at NIST by comparing aluminium versus mercury. That was quite in advance with respect to other measurements. But then in many different laboratories, frequency ratio between optical clocks have been directly measured, so without going through the microwave clocks. And I would like to mention one of them. So this is the frequency ratio between strontium clock transition and mercury clock transition measured at Liken in Japan and at CERT in Paris. And there is a nice agreement between these two measurements. And what's so special about this measurement is really two pairs of clocks that have been designed by two completely different teams, and they are able to show reproducibility below what could be done through the cesium. But comparing clocks that are built in the same place is limited. It's better if we are able to compare clocks that are built in different places. So this is an effort that we have conducted in Europe to connect the metrology lab. So here in this picture, CERT to PTB, but now we are also connected to NPL and soon to INRIM, and we hope to extend this network. And with this network, we were able to make the first comparison between two strontium clocks, two remote strontium clocks, with an uncertainty that was better than what was permitted by the cesium before. And the point of this comparison is that it goes very fast, meaning that the resolution that you can achieve with this network is more than 10 times better than what could be achieved through comparison by satellite, for instance, and it's orders of magnitude faster. So where it would take several weeks to compare clock at 10^16 with satellites, with these links, it's possible to compare them in a matter of 1 hour. Okay, and I would like to end with another topic, which is timekeeping with optical clocks. So far, I've discussed only about frequency reference. So the whole business of this systematic effect evaluation was to build a clock that has a known frequency. But what about timekeeping? So for now, the time scales that, for instance, UTC or TAI, International Atomic Time, they are mainly generated by microwave clocks. So it's microwave oscillator that is calibrated by microwave clocks that build these time scales. And if we want to move forward in the optical domain, then we would have to replace or to complement this microwave architecture with an optical architecture for timekeeping. So what would be the ingredients? So there are several things to develop. So the first is local oscillators. So to build a time scale, you need basically a clock that runs forever. So a clock that has to be reliable and possibly with a low drift. So the role of this oscillator now is, for instance, the hydrogen maser that are in many different laboratories. Then this local oscillator, which somehow is not accurate, it's reliable but not accurate, has to be steered by accurate clock. So for now, the hydrogen maser are steered by cesium clocks. You would also need to calibrate, so it's the same kind of thing as steering, except that once the data are taken, you can a posteriori estimate the frequency of your local oscillator and then have a nice calibration, precise calibration of its frequency. And of course, you need to be able to remotely compare the timescales. And so all of this is already in place for microwave clocks, but there is an effort to do the same with optical clocks, and there has been nice progress in the last few years about that. So especially there have been contribution to the International Atomic Time, so it's a calibration domain. So the calibration of hydrogen maser has been done with optical clocks, most notably at CERT with strontium clock, at NICT in Japan with strontium clock, and at NIST with ytterbium lattice clock. There have been also simulation of steering, so some laboratories at NICT, at PTB, at NIST have been able to, at least a posteriori, steer an hydrogen maser with the data from optical clocks. And the main challenge in this steering is that usually the optical clocks work in an intermittent way. So they work, for instance, 1 hour a day, and one has to be able to develop a technique to steer, to continuously steer an hydrogen maser using this scarce data of optical clocks. So all these experiments still rely on a microwave local oscillator, so on an hydrogen maser. So the question is it possible to replace this local oscillator with an optical oscillator? So there have been some nice demonstration of cryogenic silicon cavities at PTB and GILA with very low drift that could potentially replace the hydrogen maser. And for remote comparison, of course, it's important to underline the deployment of optical fiber links, especially in Europe. So things are coming along in order to have a complete optical architecture for timekeeping. So I have a few takeaway messages as a conclusion. So now we are sure that optical clocks are better than microwave clocks, and they are really taking over all what is done with microwave clocks. They have an excellent stability, so below 10^-16 at 1 second. And more importantly, it's still progressing, so there are still new laser techniques that are developed in order to reach a better stability. And this really good stability has been really what has enabled to measure systematic effect and reach an excellent accuracy. So this accuracy is around 10^-18, so both for ion clocks and optical lattice clocks. And there's no showstopper to 10^-19. And finally, I want to stress that it's really important to have clock comparison, but also be able to move timescales in the optical domain. And this is one of the 2 aspects that has been outlined as essential before the SI second can be redefined with optical clocks. Okay, thank you very much.